I tend to venture out and then want to come home and with the writing. And I felt such an affinity for Cleveland when I was there. I mean, much bigger city with an even more rich past, but that same sense that its moment had passed somehow, and what's left of the city. And yet, so my first time, coincidentally, my first time to Cleveland was right when LeBron James was leaving.
That was our lowest moment.
It was, I told my wife, I've never been to a city right at its nadir before, right at its low point. And then the next time I came back was when he came back. I felt like I had.
It was our highest moment. So
I know. I felt like I had bookended these two moments, but I really felt a difference in the city. I mean, the sort of ring of industrial stuff around downtown Cleveland, separating it from the suburbs, really connected with me. Spokane has a similar thing. It was such a railroad town that you have these vast stretches of warehouses and railroad. It's hard to imagine, but Silicon Valley will be the same way one day when the internet has spread out to the entire world. The entire infrastructure of it will be, these empty buildings. The giant Apple campus will be, people will, they'll be looking to put mini malls there. And so the trade and traffic that drove cities in the Rust Belt and some of the cities in the Northwest too. I love that. I love seeing the history right around you. I love that you can just walk and feel it. And did I always want to stay in Spokane? No. I mean, I think there are kids who grew up in Paris who think I've got to get out of this crappy little town. I think there are kids who grew up in Manhattan who feel the same way. I think it's sort of natural to want to leave the place you're from. That realization, though, that I was from this place, that the stories I wanted to tell aren't just about me, they're about the place that I'm from. They're about, a working class kid growing up in what the rest of the country might consider flyover land. And the great thing about being a novelist is it isn't, your requirements are not the same as the requirements of the Chamber of Commerce or of real estate agents. You just need great stories. And those great stories occur anywhere. They occur everywhere. I remember reading Salvatore Scabona's novel about Cleveland, The Dead, which I think, is it The Dead? I know that's the name of the James Joyce story, but
I've talked to him. I've had him in for an author talk before.
Yeah. And just thinking, I mean, I just think those stories bubble up in places sometimes that are overlooked. And I have such a love of underdogs and of the places that have fallen on hard times and are scrabbling their way back. And when I was in Cleveland the second time, I thought, oh man, I would buy here in a minute, because LeBron James or not, I just thought the downtown was thriving. It just felt like a city that was rediscovering what made itself great. And I think the same thing happened for me in Spokane. When I decided to stay, the city has really become this thriving place. People in the Northwest, in Portland and Seattle and those cities that were thriving 5-10 years ago, are really making their way here. For the last 2 years, for the first time, more people moved from Seattle to Spokane than the other way.
Wow.
And that reversed about a 70-year trend. So
yeah, it's impressive.
So I really think those mid-sized cities, those places where teachers can afford a home, where police officers can maybe still afford to live, I think those places have a certain kind of moral weight that I really respond to right now. That feels to me like what the country needs is livable, dynamic places with creative people.
So do you think that it's important for authors to have a hometown and to come to terms with their hometown, to have a home place to write about, I guess?
Yeah, definitely. I have an essay about this in one of my books, my book of short stories, We Live in Water. I have an essay called Statistical Abstract of My Hometown, Spokane, Washington. And it's about that relationship you have to the place. and to me, a hometown is like family. You know just how terrible it is. You know how embarrassing your family is, how awful your Uncle Dave is, and so you can criticize them, but when someone on the outside does, you stand up for them. And I think in some ways that's an author's job, to point out both the huge things and then the things that people overlook. And one of the things in my hometown that people overlooked was this rich moment in history, this moment when Spokane was at the center of 7 rail lines coming in, when it was the Silicon Valley of the late 1800s, early 1900s. It was, and it was considered Seattle's more urbane and sophisticated little brother. And so capturing a moment, I think I would tell every writer from every place, find the most interesting moment in your town's life and write about it. And for me, that was 1909. That was those postcards when the streets of Spokane were teeming with people, when this labor movement, the IWW, chose Spokane to challenge the ban on free speech that so many cities in the West had placed on the IWW. And so, yeah, I think that's kind of a writer's job, is to show the people of the city and the people outside the city why that place is there and what's so special about it.
Cool. Yeah, so we've got a lot of questions from the audience coming in already, which is great.
All right, well, I'll try to.
And there are a lot of the same questions I had. So if I repeat myself, don't blame me. It's just nerves.
No worries.
So first question, what was the significance of War and Peace being mentioned so much in the book?
There were a couple of reasons. First of all, I love War and Peace. I saw, I had tried to read it once and had made it about 2/3 of the way through and would tell people that it was great. And then I was in New York and I happened to see a play called Natasha Pierre and the Great Comet, which takes the sort of the heart of a couple of moments of War and Peace. And that play was so moving to me that I went back and read it again. And I read it not like an English student, but like, someone just falling in love with this writing and these characters. And the thing that I was so taken by was, it's really the story of the Napoleonic Wars in Russia, but it's how people experience history as it washes over them. From 2016 to 2020, I felt like I was in a precise historical moment as history was washing over all of us. Really, I've felt that way since 9/11. I've felt like history at some moment just washes over people. And I wanted to give Gig and Rye an aspirational book too. War and Peace is a big, thick book that is beyond their station. And so looking for a book that would have been published in 1909 that the brothers could eventually bond over, and especially for Gig early on, it's such an aspirational book that he's only read 2/5 of it, and yet is able to pronounce it the greatest work of literature in the world. And being a bit of an autodidact, self-taught person myself, I just so connected with that. I was the sort of person you'd meet in a bar when I was 23 who would tell you that a book he was halfway finished with was the greatest book written. And so it was one of those things that was both a character thing. It established these young characters' aspirational qualities, and also a thematic thing. This is what happens when history arrives in the place you're in. The Napoleonic War washes over Russia. The labor wars washed over Spokane in the same way. And then I think I'm a humanist like Tolstoy. I want the best for people. I want us to rise above the station we're in and to lift everyone else with us. Tolstoy freeing his serfs, to me, is one of those great moments of literature connecting with humanism. So that's why War and Peace. I also loved imagining it in Lem Brands Library, totally unopened, that he's got this access to all these great bits of literature and that he doesn't even know it's there.
No, and I love how the librarian, or I don't know. My ears always
It,
kind of prick up when a librarian enters a book like that. And,
there are
and
two library moments in the book, and they're my favorite. And
yeah.
I'm a kid of libraries. One of the reasons I was so excited to do this is my sister is a rural library district head, and so I am contractually unable to say no to library requests because of that. But I
keep that in
also,
mind for the future.
my first experience, my wanting to become a writer was in a library. 4 or 5 years old, my first experiences in a library, and then as a teenager, crouching in the stacks to see where my future novels would go. So I consider them probably the most egalitarian and true democratic thing we have. And so there are two scenes in libraries. One in Lem Brands Library, where the title "The Cold Millions" comes from. Rye being so sad that his brother will never see these books, and thinking about all the people who don't have everything that Lem Brand has. And the second, that moment when he's treated like such a citizen, when a librarian pulls out those beautiful Cold Million, or those beautiful War and Peace books, and sends him home with them. And when I wrote that scene, it choked me up. I was so in love with that librarian.
It is a sad scene. I think it's because how things have kind of turned for Gig and Rye there, and I don't know.
But I think it's also there are only two moments in the book where Rye is treated like a human being in a way. One is by the man who helps him buy a suit, and the other is by this person in a library who, that library is the one place he and Lem Brand are on the exact same footing. The only difference is Lem Brand would not know to go into a library. He has to build his own out of books he'll never read. Whereas Rye can, just go be there. So, yeah.
So the book is about two brothers, as we've discussed, and Gig and Rye's relationship is where the book's main emotional impact comes from. I'm one of four brothers myself, and and to me that relationship would be one of the most difficult things to write about. I would think. So I was wondering, did you find writing about brotherhood difficult, and or did you had the idea of a sibling novel in mind for a while, or?
I don't think I did have the idea of sibling novel in mind. I'm very close with my brother. We're probably best friends, and that makes it really hard to write. And so I had to allow myself to not write about my brother and me. And yet those moments creep in, and it was pretty easy because I made Gig a sort of loquacious ladies' man, which neither my brother or I is. So, but there was one moment when Gig has to admit to himself that his younger brother has taken care of him, and there are these moments when their love for each other becomes burdensome, I suppose, and that felt really familiar. I think both for my brother and me, there's such gravity around that relationship. You pull on each other like two moons that can never escape each other's orbits, and in that way, it felt really natural to write about. I so wanted to write about two characters, one who was compelled to be in this union, and the other who was just sort of pulled in, and the brothers just felt like such a way to do that.
So I wanted to ask you about Elizabeth Gurley Flynn.
Yeah.
I'm just reading some audience questions. There's questions about the other characters as well.
Sure. Yeah.
But what I wanted to ask you is, let's see. I wonder where you first heard of her. I mean, so much of her story is, I'll just tell people a little bit, like 19-year-old activist living alone in the rough and tumble West. When we meet her, she's pregnant. And yet she's a real life historical character. And I just wonder.
Yeah. It was interesting looking. So I knew about her for years because I was a newspaper reporter, and I wish I could remember what first led me to look up the free speech riots in Spokane. But the fact that there had been these protests that 500 people had been arrested, that they'd closed schools and filled them with prisoners, that the whole thing just struck me as fascinating. And so to find out that the sort of, the person who came in and really sort of defeated the corrupt police and the city officials was this pregnant 19-year-old labor activist was unbelievable to me. Well, I dedicate the book to my brother and to my dad, and my dad was a huge lover of Western novels. And I kept imagining I was writing a Western about the very last period of the West. This 1909 feels both distant and really its proximity is really close. And I mean, so as I was writing a Western, I just kept imagining that Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is the character who rides into town like Clint Eastwood, but she's a pregnant 19-year-old labor activist. And that idea of a novel just made me so happy. What if you wrote a Western and the stranger who rides into town to challenge the corrupt law enforcement is a 19-year-old pregnant labor activist? So I had known quite a bit about her. She wrote the first volume of her autobiography, and much of that background then makes its way into the novel. Many of the speeches that she gives in the novel come from, the sorts of things she would say. She really did arrive in the West at 10 years before women could vote, demanding the emancipation of the vagina. And just the audacity of that character to me was thrilling to be able to write about. I also had to have a kind of distance from her because she's so singular in a way. And as a real character, I didn't want her to take over the entire novel. I really wanted to see her through Rye's eyes. And for me, it was kind of joyous to write a character who starts out maybe with a crush on her, but by the end of the novel, his admiration has nothing to do with gender or sex or anything like that. He just thinks this is a person around whom you should model your life. This is the kind of person, but also someone who does something he can't. She's a leader in this movement, while I think Rye is someone who prefers to stay on the sidelines. There's a line in the novel that when the parade comes through, most of us are just on the sidewalk watching. And I think that's what Rye is. I think he's a bit of a watcher. But yeah, she's such a compelling figure. There are a couple of books about her that I would push people to read. Although I know you did an event about her, so I'm guessing Laura Vapner probably was someone that people talked about.
Yeah, we did have her biographer come in, or one of her biographers come in for the event, which is nice. But I'm really interested about what other material exists and what other books. So please recommend away.
So her autobiography, I believe it's Vapner, book is terrific. There's a second Elizabeth Gurley Flynn book that she wrote after she was imprisoned for being in the Communist Party for sedition, essentially, that is also terrific about her time in jail. But I really, one of the reasons I wrote the novel is I felt like she was someone who history had sort of glossed over. One of the founders of the ACLU, civil rights activist. It was such an extraordinary American life, and the fact that she isn't someone that most people know about felt to me like again, a reason to write a character like that. It's funny, I'm such a lover of historical fiction, and there are all these books about New York at every period of New York life. And so we know many of these characters as fictional characters before we get to know them as real characters. And that's another thing I wanted to do for my hometown. I wanted to treat it the way E.L. Doctorow might treat New York, to just say, here are real people tossed in with fictional characters, sort them out yourselves and go find out, which part is real.
One of the questions on in the chat is ask him how he writes so good. And I think I'll get back to that, but I do want to ask more about you formed this novel, I guess. You know,
Yeah.
how so did it start with Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, or did it start with the, I'm just curious, did it start with her and kind of form it around her, or does that make sense?
Yeah, yes and no. I did initially wonder if she would be the main character. And then again, one of the difficulties in writing about this period, writing about any period like this is, and writing about labor activists, is what they mostly do is go around and give speeches about issues that aren't issues anymore, for the most part, many of them, you know. And so having a novel where someone goes around and gives speeches, you know, is like going to hear speeches. And so that was one reason. And then I also thought Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, I wanted her to have a little bit of mystery. I wanted her to be on the back burner. So pretty early on, I knew there would be other characters. And that beginning of the novel, it's actually, there's a preface that is, the book begins and sort of ends with two police officers who were really killed, framing this whole thing in Spokane. Both of those cases, Waterbury and John Sullivan, really happened. So the novel begins there, but the very next thing, they woke on a ball field, was one of the first sentences I wrote. I just imagined Gig and Rye, these two characters, and so that I really did have those two brothers pretty early on, and having one be an idealist and the other be a realist seemed a way to avoid the didacticism, to avoid being didactic and avoid getting carried away by, you know, too much, you know, preaching about the things that I actually care about. But by having one brother be a cynic, I think I avoid having the novel preach to people, I suppose. So I decided on those brothers pretty early. You ask about the way the novel's constructed. Early on, I had this idea, this central motif of the novel being the Spokane River, which is the singular feature in this city. It's at the heart, at its heart is a series of waterfalls, and it frames the city as here because of that. The railroad came through. I mean, everything is because you have this river right at the city's center. And I envisioned the novel as the river. This third person story, Gig and Rye, being fed by these tributaries or undercurrents, which would be the first person story of Del Dalvo, the first person story of Jules, a Spokane Indian who's disconnected from his family, the first person story of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, of Ursula the Great. I imagined these tributaries or little rivers coming in. It became such a part of the book that when each of those first person sections comes into the third person river, the designer did these terrific undertow graphics to kind of underline that. And so
I read the ebook, so I didn't see that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Another thing that I don't like about ebooks. You don't get to see the curly cues, but yeah. So that with that as my sort of model, this river in which these first person stories would flow in that way, I also felt I could write a social novel. The novel in general is great for having one character tell us a story, but I wanted a bigger canvas. I wanted all these voices so that the novel itself felt a little bit like the postcard of the teeming streets that I'd seen. And so that's kind of the structural idea behind it. The other trick for me was that I tried to structure it exactly like War and Peace, with the same number of sections and an epilogue, which felt like an old time thing to do. But I happen to love epilogues. I think sometimes writers are coy and not telling us what happens after the main action of the story. And so it was a way to be sort of subversive to write an old-fashioned epilogue.
So we have, I'm looking through here, but we have a question about the epilogue, and I wanted to find it here. So the question is, I thoroughly enjoyed your epilogue, informing the readers what happened to the characters after the book ended. I love that Rye ended up owning a home with an orchard and having children. I like the character of Rye best. Okay, so I guess it wasn't a question. Sorry, well, I saw the word epilogue in there.
Yeah, I'll say one more thing about the epilogue. So the book begins, of course, in 1909, but there's a flashback to when Jules, one of the characters, worked at a ferry along the river. And that story that he tells about a boy going over the river, someone who's stolen the ferry going over the falls, becomes another motif of the novel, the idea of dying as going over. But that takes place in 1864, and then the epilogue takes place in 1964. And I wanted to frame that 100 years of the city, even though the novel mostly takes place in 1909. I wanted that larger 100-year frame to tell the whole story of my city, to tell 1864 when it's just a ferry and a few cabins along the river and some Indian villages, to 1964 when it's, when it is the city that is, I was born exactly 1 year after that. And so to sort of tell that that version of the city. One of my other favorite novels is 100 Years of Solitude, and by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. And imagining that I was telling Spokane's 100 Years of Solitude made me quite happy. So that was one of the other purposes for me of the epilogue, was to really bring the novel all the way forward into the moment, almost into the present.
So I want to ask about some of those tributary stories. Such a fun book, and there's so many vivid characters, partial list, but I'm thinking of Jules, Early Reston, Dalvo, Ursula the Great. What'd you say?
Oh yeah, Delvaux, yes.
Oh, Dalvo.
Yeah.
Ursula the Great, Lem Brand. So how much are these characters based on real historical figures?
Almost not at all.
Oh, okay.
They were, John Sullivan, who has the chapter, was a real character, and Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was a real character. Most of the rest are invented, but invented in a way, that Ursula the Great, for instance, the rich, strange vaudeville that was going on at the time was fascinating to me. And I was actually doing research and writing down all of these different acts in the library. I was just looking through old microfilm and just running through old newspapers. And I would just go every Friday to the newspaper talking about what shows were playing. And many of them were, you shouldn't write about now because of the offensive racial language that they use to describe some of these shows. But others were, people fighting animals on stage, and all sorts of things like that. And I actually wrote in my journal, Ursula the Great sings and dances with a live cougar. And I was writing imaginary ones next to real ones. And I got home and I thought, was that a real one or was it an imagined one? So I had to go back to the library and look through that same microfilm to realize I had invented it, which is, it's a great moment of kind of literary research when you realize your imagination has engaged. I like to think of it as being fluent, like you become fluent in 1909. And so the fluency I had allowed me to create this character. And then the next question was, how does she do it? And one of those great thrills of being a novelist is when you come up with the idea that she sews meat in her corset to throw to the cats. And whether or not it could happen or did happen becomes less important to the fact that you think it's thrilling that it might have happened.
It's a lot of fun anyway.
It's fun. It's really not out of line with the sorts of acts there were. I would not be surprised to find out that someone did sing and dance in a cage with a live cougar. Delvaux similarly was, I had done all sorts of research on these shady characters who often worked as Pinkerton detectives, as goons, as private eyes, and then and being able to create that early private eye character was almost like, again, I'm writing at the very end of the Western moment, and this felt like the very beginning of the noir moment. And so, Dell saying that Spokane was like a box of misery spilled over the river valley. I could hear noir in his voice. I could hear early, like he was a sort of Cro-Magnon noir character. And that was great fun to be able to put that, sort of slimy detective. And then I gave him, there's a lot of talk in the novel about sort of boosters who are, talking about Spokane having the biggest theater stage, which it did at that time, and the biggest beer hall and all these things. And so giving him antipathy toward boosters and having him punch one in the throat was another one of those great thrills of the literary researcher.
I wrote down a couple of Dell's lines here.
Yeah.
And they're kind of like mild, outdated profanity, I guess. But the situation had me lobcocked, and she went to sleep unruffled. And
yes,
even a shrill dolly mop like her, better
Yeah.
for everyone if she's making pasties and butt, or butte,
Yeah.
and avoids me for the rest
Butte,
of her life.
Yes. Yeah.
How'd you build the vocabulary for writing those lines?
Because I was imagining him as this early detective, and because so many of the Pinkertons were British or Irish, I found myself reading 19th century British detective novels, and they're terrible, first of all, but they're also the language in them. I was like, where did this language go? Why have we forsaken lobcocked? And Dell's very first words, Spokane gave me the morbs. The morbs is a feeling of.
That's a great word too.
The morbs is a great word. It's a feeling of unease, of deep existential unease about the world around you. And anyone who lived through 2020 knows exactly what the morbs is. And the fact that that we let that word go did strike me as, it was great joy to bring that back. And Dell was a really fun character, right? Both he and Ursula, the whole book for me in a way was, this, I wanted to write something big and entertaining, the kind of Western that my dad would have appreciated, about the thing he cared the most about, which was labor. My dad worked for 35 years at an aluminum plant, and he believed every person deserved a chance to build a family and a life. And that kind of basic, simple labor message, I feel like, has been lost in the politics of the world. And so it was a way to write the kind of novel my dad would have liked to read about an issue he cared about. And because of that, I think I got to be entertaining, maybe more so than I would have. I got to write villains like Lem Brand and Del Dalvo, while also, I hope, writing the sort of rich characters that I like in fiction.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat about early Reston.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, let's see, the one is just, I'd like Jess to comment on early Reston, who seems to inhabit one persona after another. I wondered if he really is a nihilist who believes in nothing and is just determined to cause chaos. Steve Bannon popped into my mind. That's from the commenter, not me.
Yes, that's actually a good call. Yeah, I think I love having a little ambiguity in a novel. One of my novels, Citizen Vince, is about the 1980 presidential election. I never say who the character votes for, Ronald Reagan or Jimmy Carter. And same way, I liked Early as less a character driven by the things the other characters are driven by than almost a force of nature, almost the personification of that nihilism, I guess I would say. And so whether or not he believes the things he talks about, I think has become less important to him. I think he's crossed some other road as a character. And I liked the mystery of his being, of who he was. In my mind, yes, he was a nihilist he was an anarchist who's gone so far down that road as to not really believe in much of anything. And I don't see him as typical of even who, while they might want to blow things up, hope that what replaces it is a more just world. I think really Reston, by the time we meet in the novel, has given into a kind of cynicism that I think is the only kind of is the worst kind of thing. But I also think of him as much as a kind of force of nature, as as willing to do whatever for either side. That was another fun character to write. And I wanted to make sure that the things he said to Rye, that his cynicism would land in a way that would kind of, shake Rye to his core. You don't want to gin the game. You want, the characters to have real choices in front of them. The other side of Gig's idealism.
Yeah.
But so, I'm gonna go with Steve Bannon from now on. I love that
answer. So I personally was really drawn to Jules' character in the book and his story and how it kind of frames the book. And I was wondering if you could talk about your inspiration for that character, I guess.
Yeah, growing up in Spokane, my family lived just off the Spokane Indian Reservation for a while. I grew up just downriver from where those horse bones were, where 800 tribal ponies were shot by the cavalry. And so knowing the tragic history of Spokane, there aren't that many places where we aren't living in the world that was created by driving the other people out. And so to live in a place named, Spokane for the children of the sun, the people who were driven from this place, is such a great, horrible, rich irony that to not have a character be able to express that felt to me like a hole in a novel like this. I've always been fascinated by Plant's Ferry, which was an actual ferry that ran. And so starting the novel chronologically in a way with Jules, this Spokane Indian character growing up ferry all the way through the IWW, through the only union he could have joined at that time, felt like the right thing to do with the novel. He, as always happens, you can think of characters as serving a purpose, and then they almost just become themselves. His laugh, his mother saying, that his father was killed for laughing. As if he'd pulled a knife, and then Jules saying, well, he did pull a knife, and saying, well, that was because he laughed at the man, and so that character starts to form and create himself, and and then his daughter Gemma too. The Jules and Gems just struck me as these two characters whose lives I really wanted to include in the novel. And again, you can't tell the story of this place without starting with the people who are here first.
So shifting gears a bit, and we don't have to talk about this forever or anything, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how the themes of the novel resonate today. As I was reading the book, I couldn't help but think about, you've probably heard this a million times, but the Black Lives Matter protests, the Capitol insurrection. And then I wondered also if there's as Rye is kind of listening to the wobbly pitch early in the book, I thought of the Occupy Wall Street and that protest movement as well. And I wondered if the kind of impetus of this went all the way back there, and if you thought about all that stuff as you were writing.
Yeah, I definitely. As I said, the first impulse was income inequality. Watching, I think probably the 2008 economic crisis, and the way the rebound from that was not to bring everybody up, but to pump money into the top. We've been practicing this attempt at trickle-down economics since 1980, and we know by all the homeless people living in your city and my city and every city that it's not trickling down. It's pooling at the top, and more people are filtering down to the bottom. And it's as a former journalist, I can see both sides of almost every issue. I cannot see both sides of income inequality. The fact that billionaires would make $1 trillion during the pandemic while the rest of us lost money makes no sense. We have a broken economic system. So that was the very first thing that pulled me to this. I wanted to write about that in a way, though, that was almost like a math problem for a child. You have to pay $1 for a job. You're only going to do the job for 2 weeks. You're going to have to pay for your health care and your food out of your wages, and then you're going to lose the job because I'm going to take $1 from someone else and send them out. That was the world that an itinerant worker in 1909 faced if they got off the train in Spokane and went to one of the 22 job agencies, job sharks, lining Stephen Street. They paid $1 for a job that was going to get yanked out from under them, so that the job shark and the foreman could split that money.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
That to me is something that doesn't take. Yeah, and it doesn't take a degree in macroeconomics. You can see that, but it also, there was a direct line for me between that and the fact that all of us, everyone watching this, paid a higher tax rate than most of the billionaires. Some of them, former presidents, and that to me is the same as that dollar. It's the same inequity passed down through generations. So that was the very first issue. Everything else, the protests, the sense of was almost accidental as I'm discovering the world that existed then and the world that exists now. I thought of them as echoes. I kept finding echoes of the Black Lives Matter protests, of the protests, the Parkland shooting survivors, these young people driven to fight for common sense gun laws after surviving a shooting, and the protagonists of the novel are, Gig is turning 7, Rye is turning 17, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is 19, Gig is 22. They're young people, and I was so taken by the way young people have walked out of schools for climate change, have fought these issues, that I really did feel the resonance and the echo of so many issues that we're dealing with now. These aren't easy issues. To me, the only one that's a no-brainer is income inequality. We should be doing something about that. Everything else takes hard work. There are different sides to be argued. But the thing that doesn't change is the passion of these young people throwing themselves into a political world that really doesn't include them the way it didn't include Elizabeth Gurley Flynn.
So leading up to this discussion with you, we did this little series of talks on working class writing.
Yeah.
And I kind of like sat here and talked to like 7 different authors who had written, working class novels type of thing.
Terrific. Yeah.
So I was, based on that, I was wondering, did you have other working class fiction in mind when you were writing this? I mean, I think the book's been compared to Steinbeck a lot. That certainly came to mind for me. But you must have thought of a lot, you must have had a lot of others in mind.
Yeah, certainly. Steinbeck, Dos Passos, Emile Zola. There are a lot of writers who found themselves, writing about the working class or about poverty. And one book that I think has always meant a lot to me is William Kennedy's Ironweed, which is again about people who are sort of run over by life, and Kennedy's Albany cycle, I think, was a big impetus for me in writing the book. There's a writer named Eula Biss who is writing right now about class in a way that I think, and money. We don't talk about money. I mean, think of how many novels, think of the novels that you love, and now picture those characters at work. We don't show people at work. It takes up a huge part of our life. It's in many ways our self-definition, and yet our working lives really get short shrift in books. And unless we're police officers or spies, and then there are entire categories. But so yeah, it's definitely something, and writing about class. in America, what's called the great class novel of all is The Great Gatsby. And it is a class novel. Jay Gatsby is someone who dreams his way up into this rarefied air, but the whole novel takes place in the rarefied air. We never see poor Jay Gatsby. And I happen to view class from bottom up. I happen to view it as an aspirational writer. And so Gig's aspiration to read all of War and Peace, Rye's aspiration to own a simple home, to me is far more moving than how many shirts Jay Gatsby has.
Have you read the book The Knockout Queen by Ruthie Thorpe? Have you
No, I haven't. No, I'll look for it.
It's just like a hilarious. I mean, it just made me think of it because it's kind of a retelling of Gatsby.
Oh,
but
really?
it's hilarious. It's a really good class novel.
Oh, I'll look for it. That's great.
So I'm going to shift back to this question: how do you write so good, from the audience? So I wondered if you could talk a bit about your writing process. How do you come up with scenes and characters? What I'm thinking of is that scene when Gig and Rye, you referred to it earlier, and I think you referred to it in the video as well, where they wake up on the ball field, and Rye says, "Rich or poor, the world is built to eat you alive, but before you go out the gullet, the bastards can't stop you from looking around." Yeah. It's such a fun, like, well-written, well thought out sentence. Yeah. How long do you have to get to know a character before you can hear them saying something like that?
I think this novel especially, I would say, much like a songwriter, some novels come to you lyrics first and others come music first. And I feel like this novel came music first. I was carrying around the sound of this novel and the characters for a long time. They're bindle stiffs. And that word bindle stiff, a stiff who carries all of his belongings on a bindle, a working stiff who carries all of his belongings on a bindle. I would walk around humming some of the words for this novel, like morbs and bindle stiff. And, at one point Gig catches on as a sawyer in a log camp and has to run a misery whip, which is a two-man saw that they call the misery whip. And so I found myself almost humming this novel before I started writing it. So Gig and Rye waking on a ball field, looking out at a fire that's been started by someone so desperate to make money that they start a fire so they can get a job fighting it, was part of the song almost that I heard, a kind of Woody Guthrie, Coen Brothers sound that I kept hearing in my head. Then once you get to know the characters, you put them in motion, and those scenes do sort of form themselves, and the novel kind of builds itself to those scenes. I knew I was writing toward the moment when Gig and Rye would be at the free speech protests, and and deciding how they would be arrested, which would be arrested. There was a moment when I imagined Jules working at the Plants Ferry, and sometimes you just want to see it yourself. You write it just so you can see it, and so anyone who loves reading knows what it's like to be a writer. You just want to know what happens next. And once I dreamed up these two characters as this way to talk about class and talk about fairness and talk about the passion for protest, and to bring Elizabeth Gurley Flynn in and to write about my city, all these snowflakes come together until there's a snowman, until there's each little idea, War and Peace, you just keep jotting them all down, researching them, and hopefully the characters are alive enough that that what seems surprising to you becomes sort of inevitable in their actions. Gig is such an idealist that he's probably doomed. Rye is such a pragmatic character that he'll probably survive. It becomes as simple as that, in a way, that you get to know them well enough that as you're creating these big scenes, everything starts to become really sharp and clear. And then when you find surprises like the fact that Lem Brands man Willard is a kind soul, they, as a writer, they're so thrilling to you. You know,
it's such a touching scene with Willard, for sure.
I mean, that when he teaches Rye to tie his tie, I was like, wow, what a great thing for that guy to do.
It's a great scene.
And those kinds of surprises, of course, I made that up, but I found myself as surprised by Willard's character as I think Rye would have been. And that's the great joy of getting lost in the book. There's so much research and everything else that precedes that, but once you get to that point, it is pretty thrilling.
I want to ask a few more audience questions here.
Okay, sure.
So one is, let's find it here. Oh, did you ever consider giving Waterbury a backstory? It was such an enticing beginning and a huge jolt to have him leave so early.
Yeah, it's I was always curious what to do with Waterbury, because there was a police officer named Arthur Waterbury who was shot to death 3 days before the free speech protests. And the police obviously were so riled up by that I think it contributed to their rough treatment. That murder was never solved. So I had this unsolved murder beginning the novel, and as I said, one near the end. I liked the idea that you would assume this was a main character and then he would sort of fall away, and that you'd land with other characters. He also is the very first person story. Every river begins with a tributary, if you think about it. And so imagining this one little first person story and then having it end before the rest of the novel started. A lot of times you're looking for ways to challenge and intrigue yourself as a writer. And that for me was a way to do that, a way to do something I'd never seen before. It also created another motif that continues in the novel, which is seeing people in their last moments. And as I was working on this novel, it dawned on me that all of these characters, if they lived in 1909, obviously were gone. They're ghosts. And the intimacy of writing about their last moments as they faced death was something I hadn't seen in books very often or ever. And it was something that was a challenge to write. And then once I got there, I sort of loved the feel of it. And so I think that was Waterbury's job. He doesn't really have much backstory except he's just moved here from another town, and and his wife doesn't like the place. That's pretty much his role in the book.
So another question is another question about the library in the book, but yeah. It's you do the library is so well drawn, and the person wants to know if it's real or imagined.
Well, there are two libraries in the book. Lem Brands Library is totally imagined. The Carnegie Library was a real building. Like a lot of cities, Andrew Carnegie's foundation built a library here. And in fact, in that video, I'm standing in front of it at one point. You can just see public library. So I'll post I can send you that link to the video. But the Carnegie Library is still standing here. It's not the library anymore. It's now an architect's office, but it's a beautiful pillared building right along the river, and I did have old photos of what it looked like inside. Lem Brands Library, like his house, is a kind of amalgamation of a bunch of different wealthy miners' homes. A detail from this one, a detail from that one, and even now, I am so drawn to those big, personal 2-story libraries with a ladder, and that I think that one was aspirational for me in a way. I'd love to have a library like Lem Brands, but every book would be well worn and read, and there'd be none with the pages still stuck together from the printer.
So Lillian from the audience says Willie Vaughton is a contemporary
Yeah,
working class writer and is fond of Ironweed as well.
Yeah,
And
Willie
so am
Vaughton.
I. So
Yeah, yeah,
I
Willie
mean, fond of
Vaughton.
Ironweed.
Yeah, and Willie's books are terrific. He has a new one out this year. Another Pacific Northwest writer and a terrific musician too.
Yeah.
He
Well,
sometimes
to pitch our
records.
little author series here,
Yeah.
Willie Vaughton is one of the working class writers
Oh, is
I
he?
interviewed
Oh,
a few
oh,
weeks ago, and he
oh,
even
really?
plays the guitar a little bit at the beginning.
He
So
does. Yeah, yeah.
don't miss it. He's a
He's If you get a chance to read Willie's books or hear him read, he's wonderful. Yeah.
yeah, he's a great writer for sure.
Yeah. Yes.
Something that he said during his talk, which made me think. I've actually asked it in a couple of these. He said that he talked about his most recent book, The Night Always Comes.
Yeah.
And he said that he was thinking about the idea of greed and how in our culture greed is viewed as good. But he was thinking about how greed animates someone at the very bottom of society.
Mm-hmm.
And in your book, I was thinking about how the idea of greed relates. And you've got Lem Brand, of course. But I was wondering, did you, it seems like few other characters have, kind of brushes with greed, I guess, or brushes with, I don't know, the feeling of maybe greed. And I was wondering if you thought about that while you were writing, just the theme of greed or.
It's such an interesting word because there are a lot of things that I think are root emotions. I tend to not think of greed as a root emotion. I don't think any baby just has to have everything. I think that insecurity comes from somewhere else. I think we want to be fed, we want to be loved. Certainly we want toys, and there's every kid on the playground who wants all the toys, but you can only have about 6 before you can't play with all the toys at once. That desire to own toys you aren't going to play with, to have more than you need, is something we all have. We all end up with more clothes than we wear. Some of us have more cars than we need, but just the idea that you're driven to just own things around you to me is a kind of inhumane motivation. I always look at what's driving that underneath. What's driving Lem Brand underneath that? What's driving early Reston's desire to get money out of this situation. I not that greed doesn't exist, it does, but I think it's both universal and not elemental. There's something else beneath it, I think. So I do find it fascinating in that way. Early Reston makes the point, you're after the same thing they are. You want $1. You want, you want more dollars. That's what you want, and and he makes that very point. But what I think is underneath Gig, I think Rye tries to make the argument, but he's 17-year-old kid. Can't really form it, that no, we want something else. Fairness is our ability to work together as human beings, to raise the others up with us. That is a transcendent thing that overcomes all of whatever small petty impulses there are. And I know it's possible because it happened in the United States. We created a middle class out of thin air. And I believe it can happen again. I'm not saying trade unions are the answer. We're not in trades the way we were when, you were a carpenter or you were this. But there is an answer to make a more fair country, to make a place where, where homelessness is not the issue it is now. And so I know it's possible because I was born into a world in which a middle class existed, and watching it pinched, watching so many people fall into poverty, to me is criminal in a way. So I've propped up on my soapbox again, and I wrote a novel about soapboxes, so I have to be careful of that.
So one more audience question, and then I always ask a few questions about books at the end.
Sure.
And if you're an audience member who has a question, now is the time. But the last one here, though, is reading Beautiful Ruins made me think that you must be the kind of writer who travels to beautiful places when he writes. Did you go to Greece to write Beautiful Ruins?
Italy.
I'm interested too.
Yeah. Yeah, that novel takes place in the Cinque Terre in Italy. It looks a little bit like Greece, but
Oh,
yeah, and
I was reading that thinking I thought it took
yeah,
place in
no,
Italy.
that's all right.
But
No, I think people transpose the places they want to go sometimes. And that novel came directly out of finding myself in the Cinque Terre and thinking this is the most beautiful place. I want to write a book about this place. And yeah, I've written novels set in New York, and I have a new story coming out. I have a book of short stories next year coming out called The Angel of Rome. And that the main story in that is also set in Italy. And so I do find myself, my wife is second generation Italian, and then I've just had other great experiences there in Rome. And so, yeah, I do find myself drawn to other places. As I said in the video, I tend to venture out and then want to come back. So every other book is in Spokane, and then the next one, yeah, I like to venture out and be inspired by some other place. I never lived in Italy to write that novel. I was there for probably a total of 3 weeks, which always surprises people. But I think the great thing about being a novelist who is a former reporter is you really pride yourself on your research and can really throw yourself into learning about a place, and then you soak up as much as you can. But my Italy is very much also an aspirational place, like a library. You know, it's the Italy I dream of in a way in that book.
So I wanted to ask you, who are your favorite novelists from the Pacific Northwest?
Wow, from the Pacific Northwest.
Well, I went to grad school in Montana, and like for a while I was obsessed with the Montana novel, you know,
Sure,
like,
yeah.
and reading this about Spokane made me think maybe I didn't cast a wide enough net.
Yeah,
So
well, I can't say if you cast a wide enough net or not, but Spokane is a great literary place. My friend Sherman Alexie is a Spokane Indian who grew up here. There's a great writer named Sean Vestal, Sharma Shields. There's some terrific Spokane writers that are writing right now too. I think growing up, my favorite Northwest writer was Ken Kesey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Sometimes a Great Notion. Sometimes a Great Notion, also a kind of labor novel, although it's very much set in that Western iconoclastic world. There's another writer who lives in the Northwest named Pete Dexter, who actually was from Philadelphia, but he lives in the Northwest, whose work I just think is terrific too. A writer we don't think of as a Northwest writer, Alice Munro, who lived in Vancouver for years, and I love her stories about Vancouver and about British Columbia. She's not a novelist, obviously. She writes short stories, but those are some kind of off the top of my head. There's so many great ones writing now that if I start naming them, I know I'll leave several out. Many of whom are friends, like Maria Semple and Jim Lynch and many others. So I think the Northwest has a great literary history, and there was a year that I was a finalist for the National Book Award, and Timothy Egan, who had written The Worst Hard Time, won the National Book Award. And the year before, there had been another National Book Award finalist from Spokane. Tim's also from Spokane. And so the head of the National Book Foundation, Harold Augenbraum, said at the time there are 2 literary poles in America, New York City and Spokane, Washington. So that was maybe one of my proudest civic moments. Yeah. It's not true. It was only true that one year, but it was a pretty sweet moment.
So if audience members want to learn more about the Spokane free speech riots, is there, I don't know, just the best book or two that you came across by researching this?
Honestly, the best book I came across was an unpublished manuscript by a history doctoral student, so named John Knight. I'm really hoping that his book can get published, because most of the research I did was pulling up a fragment here and there and there and here, and
Yeah.
there wasn't really one place. I think Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's autobiography was a pretty good place. There are a lot of books about the IWW which mention it. It'll show up in all sorts of histories of labor and socialism in America. But one of my great disappointments is that there isn't a great nonfiction book. I even thought for a while of writing a nonfiction book about Spokane and the IWW. In the end, my novelist's heart just pumps way too much fictional blood through my system. So I wanted to write it as fiction instead of nonfiction. But I'm hoping there's some talk of this developing as a TV show. So I'm hoping that'll draw even more attention to a limited series. Hopefully, hoping that'll draw even more attention. And that maybe someday someone will venture to write a book. I think a book about the entire Northwest labor wars would be a fascinating book. Oh, as a matter of fact, that's probably the closest. Hold on a second. I have to look at it to get the title. One sec. Big Trouble. There it is. Big Trouble by J. Anthony Lucas is probably the best nonfiction book about this period. It mentions the free speech fights in Spokane briefly, but it's really about this explosive labor war that was going on in the West during those years. So Big Trouble, J. Anthony Lucas.
Oh, there you go. Appreciate it. I guess last question. What you already told us though, what's coming up next is a book of short stories.
Yeah, it's a book of stories. The main one will be The Angel of Rome, which actually will be out as an audiobook. If any of you listen to Beautiful Ruins, the actor who did that story, Edoardo Ballerini, terrific narrator of audiobooks. There's a great profile of him in the New York Times a few months ago. And he and I had such success with the audiobook of Beautiful Ruins that we talked about working together on something. So we actually collaborated on a story that will be released by Audible in September, called The Angel of Rome. And then that'll be the lead story in my collection, which is made up of mostly stories set in the Northwest, but also in Italy and a couple of other places. So, and that'll be out in, I believe, May of 2022. And then I'm hard at work on the next novel, and hoping that the film version of Beautiful Ruins gets made this year, and that maybe The Cold Millions becomes a TV show.
It would be a great TV show. I think. Is it like an HBO thing? Is that? I mean, I could see it as that.
Yeah, it's unfortunately with Hollywood development, there are so many steps that we've just stepped on the track. We haven't even started jumping hurdles yet. So we've got about 10 hurdles to go. But yeah, so like an HBO limited series would be so cool. I'd love to see that world brought to life.
Yeah, it would be cool.
Yeah.
Well, Jess, thank you so much for visiting us tonight, and I really appreciate you taking the time.
No, my pleasure.
Great to talk to you.
Yeah,
thanks everyone for coming to all the programs and coming to this one in particular. We'll see you in 2022. I'll probably see you sooner than that. But
thanks, everyone.
Right. Have a good night.